Well, welcome everybody. A fantastic crowd again in on a Saturday evening for tonight's lecture, which is to be given by Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who is the first female president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And therefore, who better to launch the Women in Science Festival, which runs from today until the 28th of March. And now I want to say something about that, the nature of that event, because the University of Dundee has a very high proportion of female students. That's partly to do with the mix of subjects. But what kind of a message do we send to those students? What kind of an example do we set in our own university? And I'd like to be able to stand here and say, we set a fantastic example. But like many universities and many other businesses and other areas of public life, actually, we don't set a very good example. We have many prominent female academic staff here in the university, including many scientists and many people from the STEM subjects, which is part of what we're talking about today. And many are here in the audience. But like, as I said, many other universities, the proportion of our female professors remains stubbornly low. We were and did achieve the Athena Swan Bronze Award last year. And in our first subject-specific award went to the College of Medicine, Dentistry and Nursing earlier this year. So we are making progress. I think my mic just went off. Can you still hear me at the back, irrespective of that? It's come back on again now. That's good. So we are making progress. But progress, in my view, is still too slow. And this is an agenda that certainly has my personal commitment. Our senior management team is committed to doing better. And we have our own prominent scientist, Doreen Cantrell, who's a fellow of the Royal Society and of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who leads our work on quality and inequality and diversity. So this is really a very, very important topic. And if we were to write a report on us just now, it would certainly say could do and indeed must do better. So this is a lecture that I'm very keen to hear and to take messages on board. But turning back to tonight's lecture and our speaker, Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, who is herself an astrophysicist who hails from Northern Ireland. And many of you, I'm sure, will know that she was the first person to observe and precisely analyze radio pulsars, which is an abbreviated form for pulsating stars. And she did this at the remarkably young stage of her career, early stage of her career, as a PhD student with Anthony Hewish, who later on, with Martin Ryle, was awarded the Nobel Prize for that discovery in 1974. Now, Dame Jocelyn's exclusion from the prize was at that time rather controversial. But other prominent scientists have been clear in recognizing her important role in this incredible discovery. And one Dr. Shovsky, who was a recipient of the 1972 Bruce Medal, told her in 1970, "Miss Bell, you have made the greatest astronomical discovery of the 20th century." They weren't beyond playing around at that time, though, because quite interestingly, the abbreviation they gave to this, this pulsating signal coming from space was LGM1. And LGM1 stands for Little Green Men. And the reason being that this was just the kind of signal from space that had been sort of thought might be an indicator of intelligent life forms out there. So it wasn't until other signals of a similar kind were detected elsewhere in the sky that it was clear that this was not the case. But she's also proved that these discoveries early in her career were no fluke. And she's received numerous honours, including, of course, her DBE, Fellowship of the Royal Society, and Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, becoming its president, as I've said, very recently. She's also been president of the Royal Astronomical Society from 2002 to 2004, president of the Institute of Physics from 2008 till 10, and she succeeded Sir John Arbuthnot to become president of RSE in October of last year. She was also appointed as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Trinity College Dublin in March 2013. So that's our speaker tonight. She's going to speak to us, though, about tapping all our talents, women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So, Dame Jocelyn, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for turning out on a Saturday night. I can think of better things to do on a Saturday night, so I'm very grateful to have an audience. And thank you to the University of Dundee for the invitation. I have been to Dundee before, but certainly not in this bit of it. I'm absolutely clear. It's a very fine building. So, women in STEM and tapping all our talents. What I'm going to talk about is initially a little bit of autobiographical material. Oh, interesting. Have I? Right, okay. Let's try again. Some autobiographical material. The situation for women in STEM in Scotland, in the UK, to some extent in the world today, how we got there, and then looking ahead. But before I launch into that, I want to remind you of a Dundee woman. Best known as Wilhelmina Fleming, but born Wilhelmina Stevens in Nethergate in 1857. She emigrated to Boston, USA, with her husband, and she got a job as a cleaner, a maid, in the house that was occupied by the head of the Harvard College Observatory. He employed a number of women, because they were cheap, to, to analyze data. They were called computers. He didn't think much of some of the male staff and said robustly at one point, "My maid could do better than you could." And it turned out, actually, she was quite good at classifying astronomical spectra. So she spent a fair part of her time in the observatory as one of the female computers looking at the spectra, the optical spectra of stars, and helping classify them. Now, I have to say that for most of my life, I've been an academic. I have no knowledge of working in industry. And so this particular talk has rather a large academic focus. That's not entirely due to my background. It's also due to the fact that when we did a Royal Society of Edinburgh study, we could find no reliable data on women in business, women in industry. I think because it's not in anybody's financial interests to collect that data, and of course it has a cost attached to it. So if it's not important to you, you don't need it, why collect it? So as far as industry goes, it's hearsay. Shell will tell you it's a very good employer of women, and you talk to some, oh yes, we're using the lid of the battery compartment, thank you. And you talk to some women who work in Shell and they say, really? So I'm afraid it has rather an academic focus. And inevitably there's going to be quite a bit of looking at astrophysics and then trying to generalize from there. My personal background is I started life in Northern Ireland, as the principal has told you. I started my academic career by failing the 11+. This was an exam that everybody sat at age 11, 12, and it was meant to distinguish between those who would have an academic future and those who would have a vocational future. There is some suggestion that the exam marks were adjusted because, as you know, at age 11 or 12, girls are generally brighter than boys. But they didn't want too many girls in the grammar school stream because they were only going to get married, not work, and that was a waste of places. The options for girls who failed the 11 plus, this was the mid-1950s, were very limited because you were only going to get married and cease work. You could be a secretary, you could be a filing clerk, you could be a hairdresser, you could be an unqualified nurse, and that was about it. I was in the preparatory department, so-called, of the local grammar school, and I think my parents lent on the head teacher just a little bit because I was put in the grammar school stream for the next 2 years, and then I was leaving anyway at age 13. And I remember with great pleasure secondary school. The first year, particularly the start of the first year, you have all these different subjects. You move around from classroom to classroom. You have different teachers. You're not stuck in the one place with the one teacher. On the Wednesday afternoon of that first week, a message went round the first year class. This afternoon, the girls to such and such a room and the boys to somewhere else. And I thought, this is sport. This is why they're segregating us. It wasn't. They sent the boys to the science labs and the girls to the domestic science room. No choice. Assumptions. My parents had told me I'd get to do science when I started secondary school, so I protested to the domestic science teacher, but she wasn't hearing any of it. I told my parents that evening and they hit the roof, as did the local GP who had a daughter in my class, as did one other set of parents. And the next time the science class met, there were 3 girls and all the boys. And the teacher made us 3 girls sit right under his nose. Clearly we were dynamite. We did physics that first term, and I came top of the class, having failed the 11 plus 6 months earlier. I don't know what was going on. I would love to think the school learnt something, but I hae me doots. It's, I know now, takes a long time to change society. And the societal assumption was that the girls were going to get married, and therefore they needed domestic science, and they didn't need any of this highfalutin science stuff. It did ultimately change, of course. I think the other thing I want to say is I suspect I was quite hurt by failing the 11 plus, because looking back, I realize I didn't talk about it until I became a professor of physics. And then I thought, maybe there's something a little crazy here, and started talking of it. Our parents were keen that we had some of our education out of Northern Ireland, and I got sent away to Quaker Girls Boarding School in York for the last 5 years of my education, and did particularly physics and maths. Quite clear that physics was my strong subject. The Soviets had launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957. Panic in the UK and the USA, because we had all assumed we were more advanced than the Soviets, but we knew darn well we couldn't put a satellite up. And so suddenly there was great emphasis on anybody who could do science doing it. Well, I was probably going to anyway, but that kind of confirmed it. I felt that life in a Quaker girls' boarding school was a little sheltered, so I chose to do a first degree in Glasgow. Think this was overdoing it slightly. But, you know, it's good to be streetwise and to know what time the pubs get out so you don't go home from the library then. I ended up as the only female doing honours physics. So for the last 2 years of my degree, there were 49 men and me in the class. This was a bit of a statistical fluctuation. There were normally 2 or 3, but I ended up the only one. And when I went back to my hall of residence at lunchtime the first day, the other women in the hall of residence were saying, "Oh, you'll be changing subject then, Jocelyn." And I have to say that hadn't occurred to me, because by that stage I already knew what I wanted to do. Somewhere in my mid-teens, my father had brought home some astronomy library books. And I removed these library books to my bedroom and read them cover to cover. And looking back, they were quite a tough read for a 16-year-old, 15-year-old. But I ploughed through them and thought, wow, if I can, I'd like to be an astronomer. And I knew that the degree I ought to get in the first instance was a physics degree. So no, I wasn't going to change subject. But it was tough. It was the tradition at that time at Glasgow that when a woman entered the lecture theatre, all the guys whistled, stamped, catcalled, banged their desks, made as much noise as they could. And so I had to face that on my own every lecture for the last 2 years. It was a little bit distancing. And I found that I didn't have a group of people to work with. I was working on my own. I rather envy seeing students these days working in groups and discovering how to solve homework problems and things like that. I had to do it on my own. But that's quite good training as well. I also discovered that you can control your blushing. I have lost that facility, but I could control my blushing, because if you blushed in the face of that, they just made more noise. I'm not too cross with my student colleagues, because they were only doing what other students had told them was what students did. But the academic staff knew fine well what was going on, and none of them did anything. So I'm still a bit narked about that, as you may gather from the tone of voice. I then decided the bit of astronomy I really wanted to do was radio astronomy, and somewhat by accident found myself in Cambridge. And somewhat startled found myself in Cambridge. Up till then, I'm a provincial person, Northern Ireland, York, Glasgow. And here I find myself in this southern mecca of learning. You know what they say? Well, maybe you don't know what they say about Cambridge cosmologists. Frequently in error, but never in doubt. The place exudes confidence. And as a raw new research student, I was quite overawed by this. How many of you have heard the phrase imposter syndrome? Aha, okay, Dundee. Little bit of education coming up. It's the kind of thing that happens when people go somewhere prestigious, like Cambridge, full of very bright, very confident people. Gee, they're terribly bright here. Ah, I'm not that bright. Gosh. How did that get in here? They must have made a mistake. Oh, if they've made a mistake, they'll find out and they'll throw me out. And in a bad case of imposter syndrome, and we have it certainly in Oxford, student goes on to say, I'd better leave before they throw me out. And it's a highly contagious thing. It happens with the people who have the least confidence, which is often the women, but occasionally some men also. And we've had 2 or 3 female students leave our Oxford College because of imposter syndrome. Well, I turn up in Cambridge and they're all terribly confident and I'm a provincial. And I reckon, looking back, I was suffering imposter syndrome. But I'm also a fighter. So I said, they're all terribly bright here. They shouldn't have admitted me. They're going to throw me out, but I will work extremely hard so that when they throw me out, I won't have a guilty conscience. I'll know I've done my best. And I was being incredibly thorough and working very, very hard, And that's what led to the discovery of pulsars, which the principal has alluded to. It was just very, very patient, consistent, thorough work. Probably more than any male research student would ever bother with, but that's another story. I found the first 4 pulsars. I got engaged to be married between discovering numbers 2 and 3. I went into the lab wearing an engagement ring, which was damn stupid. But I was very proud of that ring, because it was still the case that married women didn't work. If a married woman worked, it implied that her husband couldn't earn enough to keep her, and that was really shameful. And certainly when there were kids, mothers didn't work. So my wearing an engagement ring said I was quitting. I noticed that friends were very content to congratulate me on my engagement, but said absolutely nothing about making a major astrophysical discovery. Interesting, the pressures that we put on each other in society, the way you get molded by society, and actually how very hard it is to be totally different. It's quite hard work even being partially different. I got married as I finished the PhD. My husband worked in local government, and the way you get promotion in local government is to move to another area and go up a notch. He ended up in Fife, incidentally. He moved jobs typically every 7 years, which meant I moved with him, because at that stage there was absolutely no suggestion or straw in the wind that married couples might live apart. And then we had a child 4 or 5 years later. And because it was proven that if mothers worked, the children were delinquent, there weren't childminding facilities. So how many of your mothers worked? Yeah, and how many of you are delinquent? 1, 2. Yeah, there were male professors on the radio, saying it was proven. Okay. So my so-called career has really been a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. Husband would move to, Fife, let's say. I get a job at the Royal Observatory, Edinburgh. I get the job by writing a begging letter to the director of the observatory, and get the kind of job you get when you write begging letters. But over time, I worked my way up through that establishment, and then husband says, it's time I moved. So I resign, off we go again. I write a begging letter to the nearest astronomy place, wherever we are now, get the kind of job you get when you write a begging letter, and work myself up the ranks. So just like snakes and ladders. But it has had some advantages. I started my career working in radio astronomy, down the bottom left-hand end of this family of light, electromagnetic spectrum. I jumped to gamma ray, I jumped to X-ray, I jumped to infrared, I jumped to millimeter. So I've got experience across most of the spectrum. And I've had a whole lot of different roles. I've had research posts, teaching posts. I've been an Open University tutor. I've managed groups. I've been a professor. I've been a head of department. I've been a dean. And I've done PR and outreach work. And it was useful learning experience getting to try these different things. I didn't have much choice, but, And I note that my so-called career is peaking rather nicely now in my 70s. It's a bizarre world. So, women in STEM, the situation today. We're going to show this graph a couple of times. This is Scottish data from HESA and HESA and elsewhere. Along the bottom is sort of academic stage, starts with standard grade, higher undergraduate, postgraduate, researchers, lecturers, senior lecturers, professors. And each coloured line represents a different bit of science. And up here is the proportion of each category that is female. So at standard grade, almost 70% of a class of a biology class would be female. But as you go up the academic hierarchy, it drops till you end up with about 20 or just over 20% of the professoriate female. Chemistry is the next most popular subject with girls, very closely followed by maths. And there you start with about 50% and it drops. Ignore the yellow line, computing. There's some mistakes in the data there due to the way HISA anonymizes small numbers. And the green is my subject, physics. And okay, they all start at different levels, but they all drop in rather similar manners. Okay, says some clever clods, we just have to wait. And this lot will percolate through, and all these graphs will come out like this. Except we've been waiting 40, 50 years, and it's not coming through. We start off with lots of women at the junior ranks, and they disappear. Either they drop out, or they progress more slowly than their male counterparts, and you end up with male-dominated. Going to look a little bit at the school situation. This is the left-hand part of that same graph, just enlarged. So there's standard grade at the left, higher, and then into undergraduate. And the same colours, biology, chemistry, maths, computing. It's certainly okay for the school data, and physics. This is 2007, Scottish Qualifications Agency statistics. It's changed a little bit since then, but not enormously. I'm particularly interested in girls doing physics, and it turns out that at standard grade, girls, this is 2012 now, girls make up 30% of the class, but get 38% of the grade ones. And at higher, girls make up 28% of the class and get 33% of the grade A's. So clearly girls can do physics, it's just a lot of them don't do physics for whatever reason. There's been a study by the Institute of Physics in England, and I suspect the same thing applies here as far as it can. Girls are more likely to do physics if they're in a single-sex environment. In a co-ed school, 1.8% of the girls do A-level physics. In a single-sex school, 4.3% of the girls do A-level physics. And there's a similar situation in higher education where there is all-female colleges. A higher proportion of females do physics in a single-sex environment. I'm not quite sure what this is telling us, but it's a fairly consistent message. This is a really shocking statistic, and I don't know what the situation is in Scotland. Of state-funded co-ed schools in England, about half of them don't have any girls doing A-level physics. As I say, I don't know what the situation is in Scotland. But, you know, your pipeline's constricted even before you get to higher education. Seriously constricted. And to be honest, quite a few of the girls who are doing A-level physics are going on to do medicine, not physics. So back to this diagram and our leaky pipeline. Well, it's improving, isn't it? I mean, okay, that may have been the situation a year or two ago. It's changing, isn't it? Slowly. Very, very slowly. This is the proportion of academic staff which are female by subject. I'm sorry, the colours have changed. This is biosciences, chemistry, maths, physics, and some of the electrical engineering and computing. 2003, 4 on the left, 2009, 10 on the right. And that's not what you'd call exciting growth, is it? It's just about growth. So we're nearly static. Is this something peculiar to Britain? Is this a British disease? Or is it true in many other countries? Well, I have access to data on astronomers, astrophysicists worldwide, because there is an international body, a global body, called the International Astronomical Union. And for quite a few years now, they have been collecting data segregated by gender, started by a very enlightened secretary whose wife was an astrophysicist and having one hell of a time. So he decided to start collecting the data in a segregated manner. And these are women who will have done physics degrees. And if we look at the world's league tables, I'm looking at countries which have at least 100 members of this international body, so we're not worried about small number statistics, and I have them ranked by the percentage of their cohort that is female. And in Argentina, 37% of professional astronomers are female. And it runs all the way down to Japan, which is 6%. The world average is about 15%, and Australia hits the world average. The UK at 12% is somewhat below the world average. The countries that do well, there's Argentina and Mexico and Brazil, Central Latin America. Here's Southern European countries, Italy, France, Spain, and former Soviet Union countries do quite well. The English-speaking countries, Australia, Canada, USA, UK, are on the low side. Germany and Netherlands, Northern European countries are low. It's a very interesting pattern. And I suspect there's a PhD or two in it trying to explain why the numbers are the way they are. But what makes me cheerful is if 37% of Argentinian astronomers can be female, whatever's happening here, it's not to do with women's brains. Because I don't think women's brains in Britain are going to be strikingly different from women's brains in Argentina, or Italy, or France, or Brazil. It's something to do with the culture. I think I've probably said all of this. Latin America, Southern Europe are high, Northern Europe and the English-speaking countries low. So I deduce that the limiting factor is culture, what we deem appropriate for our women and our girls to do. And it's actually nothing to do with brains. If anybody wants to follow up on the data, it's available on the web here. And I'm told that there are similar distributions for physics and for maths, although the absolute numbers may be, lower or higher, but similar kinds of patterns. The Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2012 set up an inquiry into women in STEM in Scotland. And I chaired that inquiry, and this is how the cover of our report looks. We used economic arguments, by and large, for getting more women into science and technology, because we thought that's what would be heard best. But of course, there are other arguments about fairness and justice and equality and those kinds of things. But there undoubtedly are strong economic arguments as well. We are trying to develop a smart economy, and a smart economy needs scientists and technologists. We don't have enough, and we're losing a lot of the female potential scientists and technologists. So we're wasting education costs, training costs, and we're losing talent. It's now very well established that an organization that is diverse in terms of ethnicity and gender and any other type of background you want to think about, a diverse group, organization, is stronger than a monoculture. In times of economic stress, such groups are more flexible and more robust, and probably have a better grasp on the situation. If we could double the number of women who were employed in STEM in Scotland, we'd add about £170 million per annum to the Scottish economy, just because those women would then be better paid and would probably spend more. And at the same time, we've got a shortage of ITC, computing technology people, and there's a serious shortage of engineers coming up. And we're losing large fractions of our females. I think it might be useful to reflect a little bit on the road that we've come towards the equality of women in the UK. Bodies now collect data. Well, actually, they've collected data for a long time. They now look at the data, which is the next stage. And the data shows that there aren't many women. Yeah, that's fairly obvious. That the minority gets smaller the higher the level. Yep, I think we knew that. That women progress more slowly than their male counterparts. And where we're dealing with women in academia, they put in fewer grant applications and they're less willing to have a go at job applications. So, the first stab was, right, let's fix the women. Let's make them braver. Let's encourage them to put their heads above the parapets. Let's show them how to write grant applications. Let's help them with their CVs. Yeah. The tacit assumption there is that the women are the problem and everything else is okay, thank you very much. The way we run science and society is absolutely perfect. It's the women who are apparent. So we moved on slightly from that. The next stage was to try and get special funding for women. A number of women returner schemes were devised, and actually they're still running, and I think that's very useful, except they shouldn't just be for women, particularly if we start getting serious paternity leave, not just maternity leave. There'll be male returners as well as female returners. So for people who have career breaks for whatever reason, yeah, special fellowships and things to help them get back into the swim of things sounds quite reasonable. But too much of this, and there's the risk that people say, you only got that post because you're a woman, and you're not up to it, and you're lowering the standard of our department, which has been said, I'm afraid. So it's a double-edged sword. Funding agencies began to give positions for women, hoping that if they funded a few more women in recalcitrant departments, the atmosphere would change. It was actually putting too much burden on those few women. And although the women managed to do quite good things, the funding agencies began to realize that actually it wasn't changing anything. It was just supporting those individual women. And what was needed was what we now refer to as institutional change, making organizations fairer for everybody, not just for women. And the Athena Swan program got developed. I was involved in the development of this many, many moons ago. As is absolutely typical for this story, what happened was a group of women scientists would get together every so often, meeting to think what could they do to improve the situation. We met in the margins of our main job. It was out of hours. The Royal Society provided us with a corner meeting room to meet in, but we had no other support initially. And we established various kinds of awards for universities that seemed to be doing good things to support their women. And then we came up with the idea of an award for departments or universities that could demonstrate that they were women-friendly. And the Athena Swan Awards were born. HEFCE took them over fairly soon afterwards, but it came from a small group of about half a dozen women scientists. And I think none of us could have foreseen where that would get to today. It's come a long, long way. I believe you're going to have Dame Sally Davis as a speaker in a couple of weeks' time. Yep. She's responsible for losing her cool. I don't know whether she'll tell you the story, but in case she doesn't, I'll tell you what I understood to have happened. She met with a number of senior male medics. And she said, "Where are the women?" And the senior male medic said, "Women? Doesn't matter." And she had a rush of blood to the head. And she said, "Anybody that wants any of my funding has to demonstrate that they are women-friendly by holding Athena Swan Silver." There are 3 levels of award: bronze, silver, gold. So she set the bar quite high. She forgot to tell Athena Swan. So there was a bit of a runaround, as you can imagine. But there's also been a bit of a runaround as medical departments have geared up and done their Athena Swan applications. And now that you attach money to these things, change begins to happen. I very much regret it, but that seems to be the case. This would still be in the doldrums if people hadn't started insisting on university departments and even universities demonstrating that they're women-friendly. So we're now moving on from supporting the women to looking at institutional change. And some of this is a bit harder to get a hold of. Okay, you do the statistics, you see you've got relatively few women in senior posts, you see they're progressing more slowly than their male colleagues, etc. What do? You've got to turn around the ambiance of a place. You've got to change the culture. And as we all know, changing culture is slow and very, very painful. So you start looking at possible biases in your recruitment, your retention. You become aware that men and women have different management styles quite often, and you don't tell the women that their management style is rotten. You learn about unconscious bias, which is something that men and women do. There's been some interesting experiments, primarily in the United States, but also in this country, sending out identical CVs with, in some instances, the name at the top being Jane Smith, and in other instances being John Smith, and saying, "Would you hire this person?" And men and women would hire John Smith rather than Jane Smith, and would pay John Smith more, and would provide more mentoring and training. So that clearly doesn't help women's progress unless you deliberately watch what you're doing. And I have to say, I've been in a university meeting, I won't name the university, I was an external there, a university meeting looking at professorial salaries. They hadn't done this for a couple of years, so there was a huge bank of cases. And we went through them, and I kept just a little informal tally of how many grades we upped the women and how many grades we upped the men. And at the end I said, on average we've upped the women by half a grade, and on average we've upped the men by 1.5 grades. They had a secretary who was busy recording all this, and bless them, they just all had training in unconscious bias, and on the secretary's computer was a program which would check out what I'd said, and it was true. And they went back through all the female cases and looked to see if perhaps they'd been a bit hard, and felt that in a number they had. And they more or less straightened it out. But some of this is actually very, very hard to see. It's something that's sort of like the wallpaper. Have you had to fill in a form recently where you say what sex you are? In what order are they listed, the two sexes? Are they in alphabetical order? And if not, why not? Why not now? That's institutional sexism. And there's probably a lot more like it that I can't see. Maybe some of you can see. Well, I'm tired of ticking the second box. I think it's time we put that one right. But anyway, yeah, I'll stop ranting soon. It's not my assessment form. Sorry, Dundee.
Male and female, Boxman prefer not to say.
Yes. Yes. And did you know that if you're Australian and apply for a passport, you've got 3 options: male, female, and other. But the law in Britain requires you to be male or female. And I think in that respect, we're probably bashing a number of people who don't feel they're either male or female or are in the process of transitioning. And I've tried to persuade Oxford to take a step on that, but they won't. Anyway. The United States were a bit ahead of Britain in some of this institutional change. They called it the ADVANCE program, funded by the National Science Foundation. And things can be done. This is data from University of Michigan, where I have some colleagues. And in the couple of years before they got this advanced funding, they had 71 science and engineering recruitment cases, and 9 were female. After the funding, in the 8 years since, they had 327 with 95 female. So they've jumped from having 13% female recruitment to 29%. And the funding promoted what they call institutional transformation. They don't do things by halves in the US. So they had a focus on women in science and engineering. They looked at recruitment, retention. They looked at the climate in departments and styles of leadership. So my conclusion is that Scotland needs more scientists, engineers. Scotland's failing to make use of its female talent. Girls can do physics brilliantly. Girls are more likely to do physics in a single-sex environment. And the global data shows that it's cultural influences, not women's brains, that have got us to the present position. So thank you for your interest. Apologies for the tirade, but I feel a bit strongly about this. Thank you very much.
I think, Dame Jocelyn, it should be very clear that we like our speakers to be passionate about what they talk about, and you certainly fulfilled that objective. Now, we've got a few minutes for questions. I'm going to try to chair that, but when people are asking a question and Dame Jocelyn's responding to it, if others can sort of put their hands up, I can maybe move through the questions as quickly as possible. I think there was one right at the front. Could you wait for the microphone, please?
My other question is, the argument has often been made that more prestigious professions where salaries are higher, or in countries where science professions are higher, also that correlates. So if they're more prestigious, then women are not represented as high. So if you look at the salaries in those countries, either of those, or maybe both, also contribute. Yes. And I wonder if you have that data.
Yeah. You're certainly right that sometimes there's a lot of women in the subject because the men aren't there. The men have decided to go elsewhere, to something else that's considered more prestigious or more lucrative. Usually they go together. I don't know about the schooling in Argentina. I know that there is no suggestion that it's peculiar that women do science, engineering. It's perfectly normal. So I think it's the ambiance. Doesn't need single-sex schools because the ambiance is okay.
Okay, thank you. Lady up there, thank you.
Hi there. I was wondering if you have any suggestions of what people could do if they've fallen out of the pipe and want to get back in.
Yeah. A little bit depends when they fall out of the pipe. I used to work for the Open University, so I'm enormously impressed with the way Open University can enable people to change career direction. It's extremely hard work, but a number of people do it very successfully. I guess also there'll be other routes, but it does a little bit depend at what stage you've dropped out. But for instance, these days there are MOOCs, massive online courses. Again, Open University does a lot, but there are tons of them. So a bit of diligent self-study could probably get somebody reasonably well back up to speed where they could be plausibly making applications for those kinds of jobs.
Okay, thank you. Question at the back there.
I teach in medicine, and it's quite startling how many women there are compared to men. There's much more. In fact, I had one tutorial where there's only one man, and
that's pharmacy.
No, medicine.
Medicine, okay.
Medicine. I'm just wondering what you felt the difference was between medicine and physics.
Yeah.
The difference between that.
Two things, I think. First of all, in spite of evidence to the contrary, our sisters and our cousins and our aunts think it's perfectly okay for women to do medicine. Never mind that you're humping around dead bodies, which is physically a good deal heavier than you do in engineering, where there are things to help you move things. So it's not totally logical. But I think the other thing is the way we sell physics and probably some bits of engineering, because I think it's also true that women want to feel they're making a difference, making a contribution. And clearly, if you're a medic, you're doing something useful, which is not always so obvious if you're a physicist. My allusion to pharmacy, pharmacology. When I was Dean of Science, I had a pharmacy pharmacology department in my bailiwick, and you look at the gender balance in the two, enormous pharmacy undergraduate class, and you might just find one male in amongst 200 females training to be pharmacists. Look at pharmacology, which is the research side of it, and it was the mirror image.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There's a question here, the gentleman in the check shirt.
It's not so much a question, it's another answer to the same question.
Right.
This gen, one of my cycling cronies is involved in interviewing for medical schools, and he's often said that if you're male, you're at a disadvantage because at the same age, compared with the same age of female, you're less mature.
Yes.
Which could also explain why you're getting more women going into medicine.
Yeah. Another story from my day is, as Dean, had a postgraduate medical sciences department in my patch. And very soon after I arrived, the head of department asked for an interview with me. Came in and said, "I'm very worried about the future of medicine in Britain," and paused, and I thought he's going to ask for some money. And then went on, "Now that the majority of the undergraduate body is female."
Question in the middle there.
Just to go on from that, as a medical student at Dundee, I've been through the interview process, and a big part of it now is the UK CAT exam, which is supposed to test verbal reasoning, mathematical skills and things, and a process to slim applicants down. But what a lot of the hearsay is that it's to try and increase the amount of male applicants, because these are apparently the areas male applicants do better in, and I find it quite insulting that they're more willing to work at getting male applicants in than they are to try and increase female consultants and up higher.
Yeah.
So.
Well done. Any other questions? Yes, one over here.
Oh, gosh. I just want to say thank you. Obviously, wonderful talk. And just really to, again, say thank you for the small thing at the end where you're talking about, other genders. And I think that's incredibly important. And, I think it's sort of less volume because there's obviously less people it affects. But for the people it does affect.
It hugely affects.
Yeah. So, really just thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, if I maybe could ask a question. I'm sort of interested in the idea that when you talked at the end about being slightly unhappy, that one of the ways that does fix this or can start to fix this is actually that money depends upon it. But earlier on, you showed, and this is, I think, data that has certainly convinced me, that mixed teams, and that doesn't necessarily just mean gender mixed, but diverse teams, are much more effective. Of course, in an academic environment, very often people work on academic problems on their own, and that might be part of the issue, I suspect, in academia. But is there a, can we generate data that will convince people more generally, as much as the argument around when funding depends upon it, that simply success results from pulling together teams of diverse people who approach questions in different ways and bring different personal characteristics to the group thinking?
Organisations like McKinsey have been doing work on this. They've been looking not at academia, but at other sectors of society. And, for instance, have expressed concern that a number of the bodies that were powerful in banking were white monocultures that thought the same. So they reinforced each other's risk-taking ambiance, courage. Okay. Whereas if it had been a bit more diverse, people might have said, hey, hold on. But that in turn puts enormous pressure on the few different people that are currently in boards. Yeah. They have to be incredibly tough to stand up to the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Now, I think we'll bring this part of the evening to a close, and I'm going to ask now Sue Black to give a vote of thanks. Sue.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Dame Jocelyn. I'm patron of the Women in Science Festival for Dundee, and it's an amazing festival. It's the only one in the UK that celebrates it in this way. And I hope that you'll agree that tonight we've had a very thought-provoking start to what is a tremendous 2 weeks that goes on in Dundee. I feel entirely and utterly privileged because in the entirety of my working career as a scientist, I'm not aware of ever being discriminated against. Now, that might be because I'm now a middle-aged, red-headed, irascible woman. And I was probably even middle-aged at the time when I was 18. But I'm not sure that, certainly that would apply to my parents' generation. And I think about how the choices were there for my parents were very different to what they were for me. And so I feel very honoured and very privileged, having heard the difficulties that women have experienced in the past, to being less aware of that in my world. My world is very different. As Professor Niamh Nic Dade will tell you, who's our Professor of Forensic Science, we're one of the disciplines in science that is predominantly women. We desperately like to get some men into forensic science. 100% of my honours year this year are female. Wow. 80%, thank you, Jeffrey. 80% of the students that come into forensic science are female, and they stay. So it stays right the way throughout that leaky pipeline that exists in the rest of STEM subjects. Whatever is happening in the forensic world, something very different. Whether it's because it's new sciences, it's translative sciences, maybe it's because we're all in awe of Miss Marple, whatever it may have been. But forensic science, maybe there's something in there for us to learn from, that leaky pipeline has in some way been stemmed. And I can remember in very early days coming to the University of Dundee, where my head of my college and my dean was in fact the current principal. And I can remember meetings that we would have to talk about equality. And poor Professor Downs would go around the room trying to catch everybody's eye except mine, because he knew what the answer would be when he asked for my opinion. And only an anatomist can get away with this. So Pete would say to me, Sue, what do you think? And my question was always to Pete, do you really want to know what I think? Or are you asking me because I've got a uterus? Only anatomists can get away with that. And it really was terribly, terribly unfair. But it is what we're trying to strive for here, is not for a bias on any side. It's about equality. It's about equality without borders. It's about giving people equality through choice. And if you choose to do physics, then you should be able to. But equally, if you choose not to, we have to make sure that what we don't enter into then is another form of discrimination or bias. What's important is that we understand equality and that we have choice. And the people who give us that degree of choice are people like our speaker tonight, who was a trailblazer throughout an entirely different time and a really difficult time for women within science, who've helped through the way of her career to change that. And in those disciplines where we have the bias in the opposite direction, and I hold my hands up as guilty because forensic science is there, we need to make sure that that equality is there for everybody. The festival goes on for the next 2 weeks. Professor Dame Sally Davis, we said, will end the event. The programmes are downstairs. Please pick up the programmes. The work that's gone into producing these over the next 2 weeks is just phenomenal. There is no excuse for anybody not doing a little bit of science over the next 2 weeks, whether you are female, whether you are male, or whatever you may want to be. Isn't it wonderful that we have that choice and that equality? Drinks are downstairs, but before we do, I have a small gift for our guest speaker. And if I'd just ask you one more time to put your hands together to thank her for a very thought-provoking.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.